They thought it was just another stray, dirty, weak, and worthless. So, they laughed as they hurled rocks at it, thinking no one would care. But what they didn't know was that this dog once belonged to a man who had led soldiers into battle, a man who would stop at nothing to find him again. This is the story of Max, a loyal German shepherd who had spent years by the side of a retired army general. He had known the warmth of a loving home, the honor of serving a man of duty, and the joy of being treated like family. But one day, everything changed. A terrible twist of fate separated Max from the only person who had ever truly cared for him, leaving him to survive alone in the streets. What happens when fate finally brings them back together? And what will the tourists who mistreated him do when they realize the truth? Max had once been a proud military dog, trained to protect, defend, and obey. He wasn't just any dog. He had been the personal companion of General Ameer Khan, a decorated war veteran. For years, Max had been his shadow, following him through thick and thin. He had seen things no ordinary dog could understand. He had marched beside soldiers, slept under the open sky during missions, and sensed danger before it arrived. When Ameer retired, Max stayed by his side, no longer a military dog but a faithful companion. The two had a rhythm, morning walks in the park, afternoon naps on the porch, and quiet evenings where Ameer would talk to him as if he were an old friend. Max had saved his life more than once, but now it was Ameer who gave him a life of peace, a life where he was no longer expected to fight. In return, Max did what he had always done. He stayed close, always alert, always watching over the man who had once led hundreds of soldiers. But one fateful night, everything changed. Ameer suffered a heart attack in the middle of the night. The pain struck suddenly, forcing him to collapse onto the living room floor. The house was silent except for his labored breathing. Max, sensing something was wrong, ran to his side, nudging him, whimpering, trying to get him to move. But Ameer lay there, unable to speak, barely able to move his fingers. Max barked, loud, again and again. Desperate, he ran to the door, scratching at it, barking into the night. His instincts told him that Ameer needed help. He had been trained for emergencies, but this was different. There were no soldiers around, no backup team, just him. Moments later, the neighbors woke up. The barking was too loud to ignore. Someone called an ambulance. The house that had always been so calm was suddenly in chaos. Sirens wailed as an ambulance pulled up, and strangers rushed inside. Paramedics moved quickly, lifting Ameer onto a stretcher. The sound of their voices, the beeping of machines, the smell of antiseptic. It was all too much for Max. He had been in war zones, but he had never seen his master like this. Max panicked. He ran around the room, barking, unsure of what to do. A paramedic tried to hold him back, but he jerked away. The stretcher was moving. Ameer was being taken away, and Max did the only thing he could think of. He bolted out of the house, slipping through the open door, running into the dark streets, away from the unfamiliar sounds, away from the house that no longer felt safe. By the time Ameer woke up in the hospital, Max was gone. The nurses told him he had been unconscious for hours. They reassured him that he was lucky, that if help had come any later, things might have been different. But Ameer wasn't listening. His mind was on Max, his friend, his protector. "Where is my dog?" he asked, his voice weak but urgent. No one had an answer. The house had been locked after the paramedics left. No one had seen Max. As soon as Ameer was strong enough to move, he checked himself out of the hospital. He ignored the doctor's warnings. He didn't care about rest. He needed to find Max. Posters went up around the neighborhood. Every street corner had a picture of Max with bold letters. "Missing dog. Please help." Ameer personally visited every shop, every market, every park where they had ever walked together. Shopkeepers shook their heads. Children who used to pet Max had not seen him. Stray dogs wandered the streets, but none of them were Max. Days turned into weeks. Ameer refused to give up. Every morning, he walked with a cane, stopping to ask strangers if they had seen his dog. He spoke to security guards, to street vendors, to anyone who might have seen a German shepherd wandering alone. But the city was too big, the streets too crowded, and slowly, painfully, hope started to fade. Max, once a disciplined and proud dog, had become just another stray. He wandered aimlessly, his military training slowly being replaced by pure survival instincts. The streets were nothing like the training grounds. There were no commands, no rewards, no structured routines, just hunger, just fear. The first few nights were the hardest. He didn't understand why he was alone. He didn't understand why Ameer wasn't calling his name. He had never spent a night without his master. The absence was suffocating. Max's clean fur became tangled and dirty. His ribs began to show. The well-fed, strong military dog was now weak and tired. Food was scarce. He had never needed to beg before, but now he had no choice. He lingered near food stalls, hoping for scraps. Sometimes, a kind-hearted vendor would toss him a piece of bread. Other times, he was chased away with a stick. The city was not kind to strays. Children threw stones at him. Cars nearly ran him over. Other strays fought him for territory. The once noble dog, who had known honor and discipline, was now a nameless creature in a world that didn't care if he lived or died. Winter came. The nights were unbearably cold. Max curled up in alleyways, his body shivering. He dreamed of Ameer's voice. He dreamed of warmth, of home, of a gentle hand running through his fur. But every time he woke up, he was alone. He had never felt fear like this before. Months passed. The posters of Max had faded. People had stopped looking. But Ameer hadn't. He still walked the streets, though slower now. His body wasn't as strong as it used to be. He carried a small bag of food wherever he went, just in case he found Max. But he never did. People pitied him. Some told him to move on. "It's just a dog," they said. Ameer never answered. How could he explain? Max wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier. He was family. He had saved Ameer's life countless times. And now Ameer had failed him. One evening, as he sat alone on his porch, looking at the empty space where Max used to sleep, he whispered, "I'm sorry." And somewhere far away in the city, a broken dog lay in the cold, too weak to move, his ears twitching at the ghost of a voice he couldn't find. But fate wasn't done with them yet. The streets were cruel to Max. For most of his life, he had known nothing but discipline, care, and companionship. He had always walked with purpose, always had a mission, always had Ameer by his side. But now, he was alone, just another nameless stray wandering through a city that had no place for him. He didn't understand why people now looked at him with disgust, why they flinched when he approached, why shopkeepers chased him away from food stalls, brandishing sticks as if he were a threat. He had never known a life where he had to fight for scraps, where every step forward was a battle for survival. His military training had taught him endurance, but hunger was a new kind of enemy. It gnawed at his stomach relentlessly, weakening him day by day. His fur, once clean and groomed, had become tangled and matted. The proud, muscular frame that had once intimidated enemies now trembled from exhaustion. His ribs protruded, his gait unsteady. He was no longer a soldier, just a shadow of what he used to be. Max tried to find food where he could. Sometimes, a kind stranger would throw him a leftover piece of bread, and he would devour it as if it were a feast. Other times, he would sniff through garbage, his once sharp senses dulled by fatigue. And more often than not, he was met with kicks, curses, and closed doors. For the first time in his life, Max knew what it felt like to be unwanted. Once, he had been a protector. People had looked at him with admiration and respect. They had called him strong, loyal, brave. Now, they called him a nuisance, a filthy stray. The worst was the children. He had always loved children. He had been trained to be gentle with them, to watch over them, to protect them. Ameer's grandchildren had often played with him, their laughter filling the house, as they tugged at his ears and hugged him tightly. But these children were different. They didn't see a friend. They saw something to torment. "Get away, dirty dog," a boy yelled one evening, throwing a stick at Max. Max flinched and took a step back, confused. Another child picked up a rock. It was small, but when it hit Max's leg, the pain was sharp. He whimpered, stepping back further. But the children only laughed. He didn't understand. He had never harmed them. Why were they hurting him? He turned and ran, his heart pounding, not from fear, but from something worse, a kind of pain he had never known, the pain of being hated for no reason, the pain of being abandoned not just by Ameer, but by the world. That night, he curled up in an alley, his body aching from hunger and bruises, his spirit aching from loneliness. Days passed, weeks, each one harder than the last. Winter was setting in, and the nights had grown colder. Max had found a small park where he could rest during the day, hidden under a tree. It wasn't home, but it was safe, at least for now. The grass reminded him of the fields where he and Ameer used to walk. The rustling leaves sounded almost like Ameer's voice calling his name. Max closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of peace, a moment to imagine that things were the way they used to be, that any second now, he would wake up to Ameer's hand scratching behind his ears, telling him it was time for breakfast. But peace never lasted long for a stray. A group of tourists entered the park, their laughter ringing through the air. They were young, carefree, and excited, their cameras swinging from their necks as they took pictures of everything: the trees, the birds, the benches, each other. Then, one of them spotted Max. "Hey, look at this dog," a woman said, pointing. Max lifted his head, his ears perking up. Maybe, just maybe, one of them would be kind. Maybe they would have food. Maybe they would see him and think of their own pets, their own dogs waiting for them at home. But he saw it in their eyes before the words even came. Disgust. "EW. It looks like it hasn't bathed in years," another said, wrinkling her nose. "He's so ugly," a man sneered. "God, why are there so many strays here?" Max lowered his head, feeling shame burn through him, as if he had chosen this life, as if he had wanted to be like this. And then the first rock hit him. It struck his side, sharp and sudden, making him yelp in pain. He scrambled to his feet, his instinct screaming at him to run. But before he could, another rock hit him. Laughter, more voices, more stones. Pain exploded through his frail body. His legs trembled as he tried to move, but the stones kept coming. One hit his shoulder, another struck his paw. He let out a desperate whimper, but they didn't stop. They didn't care. To them, he was nothing, just another flea-ridden stray, just an eyesore in their perfect vacation pictures, just something to torment for fun. He tried to run, but his weakened body failed him. He stumbled, his vision blurring, his heart pounding. And just when it seemed like there was no escape, a voice roared through the air. Stop! It wasn't a request. It was an order. A voice filled with authority, with power, with fury. The tourists froze. Max, barely able to stand, lifted his head weakly, his ears twitching. A man was striding towards them, his cane hitting the ground with each determined step. His face, lined with age and exhaustion, was twisted in rage. General Ameer Khan, his eyes, once sharp with the discipline of a soldier, now burned with something deeper, something raw, something primal. The tourists looked at each other, uneasy. "It's just a stray," one of them muttered. Ameer's grip tightened around his cane. His voice was steel. "That is not just a stray." The world seemed to hold its breath. Max, through his pain, through his haze of hunger and exhaustion, knew that voice. His body may have been weak, his spirit may have been battered, but he knew that voice. Ameer took another step forward, his fury radiating off him in waves. "That dog," he said, his voice unwavering, "has served this country more than you ever will. That dog has saved lives. That dog has more honor in his paws than you have in your entire being." The tourists hesitated. Their amusement was gone now, replaced by nervousness. They hadn't expected to be confronted. They hadn't expected someone to care. Ameer turned to Max, his breath caught in his throat. The proud, strong companion he had once known was gone. The dog before him was a ghost of what he used to be. Thin, scarred, eyes filled with a pain that no creature should ever have to endure. Ameer's heart clenched, and then softly he called, "Max." Max's ears twitched. His body, so used to pain and cruelty, hesitated. Then slowly, so slowly, he took a step forward. Ameer opened his arms, and for the first time in months, Max ran. Not away from fear, not away from pain, but towards home. "Stop!" The word echoed through the park like a gunshot. The tourists froze, their hands still clutching the stones they had been so carelessly throwing. The playful laughter that had filled the air just seconds ago died down, replaced by an eerie silence. The atmosphere had shifted in an instant. An old man, his posture firm and commanding, strode toward them. Though his body carried the weight of years, there was no mistaking the power behind his presence. He wasn't just anyone. He was a man who had seen war, who had led soldiers into battle, who had once stood tall in the face of danger without flinching. It was General Ameer Khan. His piercing eyes burned with fury as they scanned the scene before him. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, but it wasn't because of exhaustion. It was rage. He had fought enemies on the battlefield, but today, he faced a different kind of enemy: cruelty, ignorance, and blind hatred. And the victim? His loyal companion, his Max, the dog that had once been his shadow, his protector, his family. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ameer's sharp eyes locked onto the frail, trembling figure before him. His Max, his strong, fearless warrior, was now nothing more than skin and bones. His once glorious coat was matted and dirty. His ribs jutted out like they were trying to escape his body. And his eyes weren't the same. They were tired, empty, and lifeless, like a soldier who had been left behind in battle. Ameer felt his heart crack open. He had imagined this moment so many times, dreamed of the day he would finally find Max again. But not like this. Never like this. Ameer took a hesitant step forward. His voice, which had commanded legions of men, softened to a whisper. Max. At the sound of his name, the dog's ears twitched. His frail body barely moved, but his eyes, clouded with pain and exhaustion, flickered upward. He knew that voice. Somewhere deep within the broken shell of what he had become, he recognized it. Ameer dropped to his knees. His hands trembled as he reached out, his vision blurred by unshed tears. "It's me, Max. I'm here." Max's body remained motionless for a moment, as if his mind was struggling to believe what his ears were hearing. But then a spark, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of recognition, lit up in his dull eyes. His tail, which hadn't moved in months, gave the faintest wag. The tourists watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded before them. The dog they had just tormented wasn't just another stray. He wasn't a filthy, forgotten creature. He was loved, he was wanted, and he was a soldier's best friend. Max took one shaky step forward, then another. His legs wobbled beneath him, his body threatening to collapse. But he pushed on, because in front of him was home. In front of him was the man he had spent his life protecting, the man who had never given up on him. And then, with all the strength he had left, Max lunged forward. He crashed into Ameer's arms, his body shaking with sobs only a dog could understand. He buried his face in the crook of Ameer's shoulder, whimpering, crying, releasing a year's worth of loneliness, suffering, and fear. Ameer held him tight, his fingers digging into Max's dirty fur, his own tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have found you sooner. I should have never let you go." Max didn't care. He didn't care about the hunger, the pain, the cruel hands that had beaten him, the stones that had bruised his body. None of it mattered now, because he was home. The tourists looked at one another, their faces pale with realization. Shame settled in their stomachs like lead. They had laughed, they had mocked, they had hurt an innocent soul. And now, as they watched the raw, unbreakable bond between the man and his dog, they understood the depth of their mistake. One of them, a young woman, dropped the stone she had been holding. It hit the ground with a dull thud, but in her ears, it sounded like a cannon blast. She had been so blind, so thoughtless. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice small and full of guilt. We didn't know." Ameer turned his head, his eyes sharp. "You didn't know." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying edge of steel. "You didn't know he was once a soldier's companion, a hero's best friend." The woman swallowed. "No, we just saw a stray." Ameer's eyes darkened, and because he looked different, because he was alone, he deserved cruelty. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. No one dared to answer. Ameer sighed and looked down at Max, who was now curled against his chest, his breathing steady, his eyes closed in peaceful surrender. He had been fighting for too long. He had been alone for too long. "Every stray has a story," Ameer said finally, his voice softer now. "Every abandoned soul was once loved by someone. Before you throw stones, before you mock, before you dismiss them as nothing, remember that." The tourists couldn't meet his gaze. Some shuffled their feet, others wiped at their eyes. They had been cruel without reason, and they would carry that guilt for a long, long time. Ameer stood slowly, lifting Max into his arms as if he were the most precious thing in the world. And to Ameer he was, without another word. He turned and walked away, leaving the tourists to wrestle with their shame. As they disappeared from view, Max sighed deeply, his body relaxing for the first time in what felt like eternity. He was safe, he was home, and he would never be lost again. From that day forward, Max was never alone again. But the journey back to the life he once knew was not as simple as stepping into the general's arms. His body was weak, his spirit battered. The world had been cruel to him, and it would take time for him to believe that he was truly safe again. Ameer carried Max home, his hands trembling as he felt the sharp bones beneath the matted fur. This was not the strong, disciplined dog he had once known. This was a survivor, a warrior who had fought battles of his own, against hunger, fear, and loneliness. Guilt gnawed at Ameer's heart. He had lost Max once, but he swore he would never lose him again. The first night back home, Max didn't sleep in his old bed. He didn't even step inside the house. He lay curled up near the doorstep, eyes darting at every sound, as if expecting someone to chase him away. Ameer sat beside him, whispering his name, reminding him that he was home. That night, the general barely slept. He kept a protective hand on Max, reassuring him with his presence, just as he had done years ago when Max was a young pup, nervous on his first day of training. The days passed, and slowly, Max started to heal. The warm meals, the soft bed, the familiar scent of his master, all of it worked like medicine for his soul. His fur grew back, his eyes regained their spark, and one morning, after weeks of silence, Ameer heard a sound that made his chest tighten, a faint, tentative bark. It was a sign that Max was coming back to life. Ameer took him to the park, not to relive the painful memories of that cruel afternoon, but to show him that the world was still kind. The same park where he had once been pelted with stones was now a place where children cautiously approached, whispering, "Is he really a military dog?" Ameer nodded with pride. "He's more than that. He's a soldier's best friend." One by one, people started recognizing Max's story. The shopkeeper who had tipped Ameer off about his location spread the word. Soon, locals who had once ignored him as just another stray began greeting him with gentle pats and kind words. The tourists who had hurt him, they had long gone, but their cruelty left an important lesson behind, because you never know the story behind a stray, and sometimes, the ones you look down on have the most honorable pasts of all. Max's story was no longer just about survival, it was about resilience, about second chances. He had endured the worst, but he had also found his way back home. And as he sat beside Ameer on their porch, watching the sunset, he knew one thing for sure. He was loved, he was safe, and this time, he would never be lost again. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible animal stories. You never know whose life might change next.